Okay, welcome back. Let's get rolling. Just to let you know, I've gone ahead and posted your grades for those of you who turned in the first Canvas prompt last Friday. And I have to say, across the board, I think people did a really, really great job. I particularly like the degree to which you all were engaging with the readings, talking about the sort of parts of social movements. There were a lot of great examples you all incorporated of some of the social movements that you're interested in, and maybe even want to explore further for your annotated bibliography or paper later in the class. And I also enjoyed the way that you all were talking about the Griffin reading and where the Griffin reading fits in, right? Because some of these pieces, like the Griffin reading, like the Heenan reading that we talked about last week, or last class, they're old, right? And I think that some of their language is kind of outdated, and the way they think about movements is outdated. I think they have things we can kind of use and salvage and incorporate. And I also think they give us a little bit of a groundwork as we get into some of the readings that we'll be talking about for today that talk about a little bit more recently some of the ways that movements and advocacy can be understood. A lot of people pointed out in their response that some things, such as the role of social media, have definitely changed the way we think about movements. We'll talk more about that next week. I also really like the comments that we're talking about how social movements don't necessarily have the same end that Griffin might be talking about, right? A lot of you pointed out that a lot of movements, for instance, things like Black Lives Matter, missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? So many of these movements are still happening, are still ongoing, and treating it like a movement has this end or this resolution doesn't really get at some of the dynamic elements of movements. So I definitely encourage you all to continue to think about these ideas, right? And the way that how we can even measure and explore social change and social movements has changed so drastically just in the last 10 years that it really helps us to think about this communication as dynamic and ever-changing. So we'll be looking at some of the roles that media has next week in a bit more detail, and I think that'll help us to situate that discussion too. So again, really good thoughts and observations there. So last class, we spent some time talking about social change and some of the strategies that were incorporated in social movements, particularly looking at things like civil rights, Vietnam protests, and campus integration. Just as a note, since it was an area that folks wanted to learn a little bit more about, the Freedom Rides were actually a series of protests against bus segregation. So a lot of civil rights activists and leaders would occupy the buses and participate in those rides to end the practice of racial segregation. So one of the things we noticed is that there's a lot of unique strategies and approaches that these movements used at the time that go outside of what I think people used to think of rhetoric as, but they're still rhetoric, they're communication, they're just happening in these dynamic and new ways, right? I also appreciated in the group discussion and some of your thoughts, right? There was pushback against some of the ideas and arguments that were presented by the authors. And just so that you know, right, I think the sort of pushing back critical thinking of authors, of concepts, and ideas that might come out from the readings or come out from our discussions is awesome, right? That's the point. And I think that for a lot of teachers, myself included, like, it's great to see that happen. None of the readings or ideas that are, presented in those readings are gospel, right? The process of communication, of our research in communication is that sometimes we have to break something down, say that something's wrong, push for something to be better, right? That's a kind of dynamic process that we're all trying to do. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you are just kind of disagreeing with what's presented in a reading, maybe there's, things that are outdated or not in line with how you're thinking about an issue or topic, right? I encourage you to bring that to the table because I think that makes us smarter and makes us better at what we do. Communication, social change, it's a complicated topic. There's a lot of challenging issues that we're grappling with and dealing with. So how we think about and frame those topics, I think, is incredibly important. So I appreciated that discussion really got going yesterday or on Monday and thinking about those things. Just as a quick recap of some of the ideas, right, that came from this reading, the sort of central argument here is that a protest is essentially creating a situation. In a lot of contexts, right, an issue isn't necessarily being talked about or being identified in a way that is getting the kind of attention or focus that it might be, right? The amount of attention and feedback on issues, racial justice, and structural racism, right, was an area that in many sectors and communities was just not getting attention. We can judge, of course, the quality of response, right? I think that companies who are doing the exact same thing, but like had a very general statement about support for Black Lives Matter, we can critique that. But this idea here is that protesters, people who are practicing civil disobedience, they are creating a situation that is inviting a discussion, right? So for instance, something like Rosa Parks or something like the Freedom Rides are events that are creating and inviting this discourse to happen. So a lot of times protesters will have these kind of catalyst major events that are designed to get attention, right? The food vendor who set himself on fire that in many ways sparked the Arab Spring was creating this type of event or scenario that really got things started. So moments like that, right, catalysts, going back to Griffin, can create these opportunities for discussion in ways that might not be talked about to the extent that members of a group want. There's an imbalance of power and there's less opportunities for discourse, according to Heyman, that more confrontation is justified, right? Another example of this was, and we'll talk about this one later in the class, there's a movement called ACT UP that is about HIV/AIDS awareness. In a world before PrEP, right, there was not necessarily discussion about HIV support. So there were a lot of protesters as part of the LGBTQ community who sat in on congressional hearings and like targeted specific state senators to try to get them to support healthcare research and initiatives about HIV/AIDS care. So this idea here that essentially forcing people to participate or engage in a topic that they might not otherwise is a big goal that's being looked for there, right? If things are clogged, if things are not working, that protest is an opportunity to start a discussion. So I wanted to kind of give an opportunity here. I know we were talking a little bit about this reading. And I think there was starting to be a discussion about where we kind of felt like he was wrong in talking about this, or in some of the ways that he was framing or using language to describe this issue. And I just wanted to see if there were any other threads from last class's discussion or things that people wanted to bring to the table there that we were not able to sufficiently give time or focus on from last class. If there's not, that's okay, right? I think some people were pushing back and saying that, some of the ways that he was comparing like some protesters to Nazis, right, is probably not a good approach to do. The way that he was sort of kind of categorizing all protesters as falling under a confrontational or potentially violent approach, right? I appreciated that people were identifying and pushing back against that because, again, I think creating that space and opening up that space, if you find yourself disagreeing with an idea or thought that's coming out of the reading, coming out of our discussion, is something that I want to continue to invite. So I appreciate that. So for today, I wanted to explore a couple of those examples that came out of the CRIC chapters, right? So the CRIC reading that I'm asking you to look at has that ebook. You can also get a copy from the bookstore or rent a copy. And if you're having issues with accessing it, let me know so that I can help you to get a PDF of those two chapters. The CRIC reading is essentially an edited collection, right? Each chapter is a different author and a different idea related to social movements. And I wanted to cover a really broad range. The two that we're going to be looking at today, one is about labor and farm workers, primarily farm workers of color in California. And then the second one is looking at Occupy Homes Minnesota, that was dealing with a housing crisis in 2011 and the way that the housing crisis disproportionately impacted populations of color in Minnesota. And some of the ways that both of these movements exemplify, I think, a lot of really engaging ideas about social change and what works on the ground. Also, I mentioned that I've been in touch with Oregon Rural Action, which is a nonprofit that does some advocacy in the area, including advocacy surrounding areas like clean drinking water and access to COVID-19 vaccines and other resources. I'm actually setting up a meeting with them, and hopefully we'll get somebody from them who will come to class to tell us a little bit about what they do and how they use some of the things we've been talking about. So that should be exciting. I'll give you more details about that as we get closer. And then the other thing that I just wanted to remind you before we get started on the new stuff is just that the second Canvas prompt is due on Friday, as well as that syllabus quiz, open node, open book. So just make sure that you have completed that by Friday, and you'll be in good shape there. Any questions about anything we talked about last class or anything more generally about the class at this point? Again, if questions do come up at any point, feel free to let me know. All right, so I think that there are kind of two categories of things that are really useful and worth learning about each of these readings that we'll be looking at in the class, right? One of them is that the movement itself, the history, what's happening in that movement is incredibly interesting and I think enhances our knowledge of the world. You might be familiar with some of these ideas and movements on your own, but I think looking at them from a communication perspective is really helpful. But I also, again, am into this idea that there is something universal or something broader that we can learn from the study of specific movements, right? There are things that worked or things that happen within those movements that we can take away with us and we can use to broaden our understanding of social change communication more generally. So I think as you're working through these readings and these discussions, think about that with that in mind, that there are broader things that we're taking away in addition to the things that are interesting about the movement itself. Okay. So again, thinking about rolling the boulder and some of the ways that things continue to be challenges, right, are ongoing. One of these cases was the 1966 road to Sacramento. How many people are familiar with Cesar Chavez? Okay, so a few people are nodding, right? There's a good chance if you have spent much time in a large city that a road was named after him, right? Oftentimes it was like Cesar Chavez Road or Lane. That along with Harvey Milk are used pretty commonly. So Cesar Chavez was a prominent farm worker and also a farm worker activist and a proponent of labor and farm worker rights. And he played a really integral role in this social movement in 1966. In California, at the time, agricultural workers were overwhelmingly people of color, were overwhelmingly underpaid, overworked, had really bad and dangerous working conditions. A lot of agricultural and farm equipment was not safe, right? So you had workers who were subject to those dangerous conditions, who would lose limbs, right, in trying to do that work. And as we know, right, unfortunately, a lot of these issues with labor compensation and support for labor among agricultural and farm workers persist and continue to be issues. So workers at the time, right, were experiencing incredibly poor pay and poor working conditions, and were really frustrated and really needed a change. One of the things that helped to catalyze this was the Delano grape strike in 1965. And it actually involved many farm workers who, again, had this network and connection to a larger organization, in this case, Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, who went through a bunch of vineyards in Sacramento and broke down the vineyards, like would strike down the vineyards in an effort to raise awareness about the working conditions, labor that was being experienced, right? So you had a lot of executives who were wanting to have production of wine. That production halted, and there was suddenly attention that was being directed toward the plight and issues surrounding workers. So that was one of the big things that was bubbling up and creating this sort of rhetorical situation for this movement. I wanted to share a couple videos that also highlight some of the elements of this movement, right? Because the movement itself involved this use of physically marching for a really long period of time. Right? And as mentioned, a major actor within this movement and within this march from Delano to Sacramento was Cesar Chavez. One of the really interesting things that's touched on this article about him was that he had actually had a major foot injury that happened while he was doing the march, right? So the other protesters and supporters were essentially kind of marching with him or for him, right? That this idea of solidarity and support that happens in a movement oftentimes means that people who were not even there physically still have these opportunities to be heard, represented, and participate. In some of the work that I do, I look at the rhetoric of disability rights online and people who were not able to attend sites in person, who are somewhat similarly using advocacy through other people and creating that sense of solidarity, even if you're not there. Right? So Chavez had a really major role in labor and in labor organizing, right? But one of the critiques that I think some of you raised about the Griffin piece, and some of you think more generally about with social movements, is they're not about a single person. You have a single person who helps to organize or direct or guide a movement, but at times, right, you have these fissures and separations that exist within a movement, right? So we oftentimes associate movements with people like Martin Luther King or people like Cesar Chavez, but while they play an incredibly important role, right, movements exist beyond that single person. And studying movements means we also need to think beyond that single person. And I wanted to give you a visual here about this march because 300 miles across California, right, was incredible for the time and incredible more generally, right? Delano to Sacramento. And going nearly 300 miles, about 200 people, right, was this major demonstration and movement that moving across such a long distance and using that spectacle to communicate about working conditions really highlights the visual element, that this was both a demonstration, that people were marching, they were holding signs, right, they were showing their support, but it also, to a lot of participants, was seen as a sort of pilgrimage. In fact, a lot of members of this march were bringing things with them, like personal belongings that were really important to them, and really involved doing this laborious physical journey, passing through towns as a way of really trying to drive home this message. And again, right, this the agricultural industry in California was and continues to be massive and had this very large ripple effect, that there is this ability to bottleneck this issue and draw attention to it in a way that was not being seen as an area of focus. Share a little bit about this movement.
On St. Patrick's Day, Thursday, March 17, 1966, striking great pictures from Delano began a 300-mile pilgrimage northward through the valley of their labor to the state capitol in Sacramento.
So one of the things I find especially interesting is the way that the movement is physically growing as people pass by, right? More and more people were joining in and participating who might be directly involved. Also, as you noticed, right, there were a lot of flags being held. There were also a number of signs that were indicating sort of protest and boycott of the agricultural industry, including grapes in California, right? So this movement, I think, was narratively powerful, but it also involved this element of physicality, right? If we think about something like a protest, a march for social change, right, we oftentimes think about the presence of physicality at a space, right? That somebody is holding up a sign, somebody is occupying a territory. There's this focus on physicality at an event that historically has been seen as incredibly powerful or meaningful, right? Again, an example that immediately comes to mind, again, regardless of your position on it, was the Women's March on Washington that happened in 2016, early 2017, right? And there's also this idea that a movement is happening within a specific location, but it's also happening more broadly, right? That there's this challenging relationship between local politics and local change with a broader national change as well. That the plight and challenge of workers in places including California and agricultural workers is not limited, of course, to California, but there's a specific movement in California that in many ways has helped to catalyze and inform how we think about a lot of agricultural and labor policies currently. So I think that this march essentially adds a lot to what it is that we think about when it comes to social change and how to communicate about social change effectively, right? If we look at this 1966 march and the way that it's being framed and talked about, it refers to this idea that a social movement is always an assemblage of meaning. In other words, we have to think about and define what a movement is and what a movement is contained, and that is not necessarily static. That a movement changes over time in issues and topics that it might choose to focus on, in politics and changes that might happen within a specific location, right? Again, going back to the example of the Arab Spring, started in Tunisia, but the spread and impact that it had on a number of countries over time and the governmental response to those protests are examples of how what started as a country could escalate into many different nations. In other words, a movement, right, or a protest or some type of activism is both an event, right, in itself, and is also being used as a tactic. And I think that's an important idea that the authors point out, that there is the spectacle and attention. If you were a passerby in California who was not aware of or is informed about this, the experiences of agricultural workers, that it sticks with you, right? It draws attention. When I was visiting my family in Washington and I drove by, there were workers outside of school that were on strike. As a teacher's strike to ensure better pay for teachers, right? Those moments when you find that those protests and those issues that don't normally come on your radar, but are incredibly personally important for people, that event draws your attention. But then a movement, right, and the use of protest, including physicality, is also being used as a tactic. That sometimes it's about volume. For instance, if you amass a large number of people to protest or show up at an event, right, that can be used. It can also be used as a tactic in terms of how that group is communicating. For instance, is there something that is being chanted or said over and over again? And another thing to think about is novelty. Is the protest or movement saying something that is incredibly striking and is drawing your attention to that movement in a way that it otherwise would not have? And again, the way that people were bringing personal belongings, holding things like flags and carrying it such a distance was used as a tactic of that movement. So there's this idea that gets brought up from in this chapter from Daryl Wandsworth-Serrano called intersectional rhetoric, right? And intersectionality, of course, is a framework for thinking about human experience and oppression that thinks about the intersection of people's lives, and of course, is rooted in Black feminist thought and theory, right? Intersectional rhetoric in this reading is talking more about how a movement is a combination of different factors, right? So a movement is the march itself, it's also press, it's also organizing. If we think about movements currently, right, there might be a physical march, there might also be the presence of social media and the sort of expression of perspective and use of protest or activism virtually, right? This idea here is that a movement is this combination of different things. People are singing, people are holding signs or flags, people are just walking, people are talking to people that they're passing through. In this way, the movement is shifting across space and time. It is literally physically moving, right? We don't get to just easily pin it to this one part, but as it's passing through different towns and locations, it's changing. So this march is about an assembly of bringing people together and of bringing this notion of motion to the table. If we think about it, right, it's strategic and valuable for us to imagine that they are walking to the Capitol, right? They chose Sacramento as a destination on purpose. They are trying to send a message to Sacramento about the need to change agricultural policies in the state of California, right? So social motion and momentum become really important. This is not to say that all social movements necessarily involve something like a physical march. In fact, a lot don't, and there's questions about accessibility in terms of who gets to participate in that way. Just to say that the use of something like a march or that type of assembly can be a powerful tool in the toolbox of an organizer. So one idea that gets talked about here is this notion of an assemblage. And there's also a talk about this sort of protest itself being what's referred to as rhizomatic, which is an idea that I wanted to unpack a little bit because I think it can be a little bit weird if you're suddenly seeing this discussion. So this idea comes from a couple authors who are very in the postmodern world called Deleuze and Guattari. And the idea is that if you think about the structure of a tree, right? The tree is tall, it's got roots, it's very linear, and there's a hierarchy, right? There is the roots at the bottom, there's the top of the tree, and that hierarchy is a contrast to thinking about a rhizome. A rhizome is something like ginger, right? Or something like other types of plants and a lot of fungi are not like top down, but rather they're connecting and like weaving and tangling up with each other, right? In a lot of different ways that don't necessarily involve that like linear hierarchical structure. In this way, talking about plants and talking about the structure of a rhizome, right? The idea that something like ginger is connecting and offshooting in a whole bunch of different directions is a way to think about a social movement. The idea here being that when we communicate about social change, it doesn't have this leader and follower. It's not moving in a set path, but that it's about these changing connections and relationships. That a movement is suddenly in Fresno and there's a few people who join and hear what the movement is talking about. Or a movement becomes viral and takes to social media, right? Or a movement is suddenly being talked about and shared on TikTok. This idea that movements are unpredictable and that they can impact us in very different ways over time, and that the elements that come together to create a movement and to create activism are varied and dynamic is what the authors are getting at here, right? Movement is not just this thing that happened and then it's done. A movement snowballs, it impacts other people, it spreads and changes. As mentioned, right, as you all got to see in those videos, the march was visual. There's the spectacle of people being there. It's verbal, right? They're advocating for that change, and it's material, right? The physicality of being in that space and engaging in that space is part of the argument. That seeing the challenge and strife that workers were facing and their willingness to go such a distance to do so, to be motivated against things like depressed wages, bad housing, racial oppression, and a perception that politicians were not listening to and responding to them, were the things that really helped to drive a movement. In fact, a lot of these types of movements and advocacy are powerful because they're personal, right? They're people that are impacted in an incredibly proximal way. You know, there was that clip at the very beginning that showed families and showed, you know, labor and housing shortages and people not able to take care of their families who were marching for their lives. So I think thinking about these kind of movements in that context speaks to some of the persuasive power that they have. And then that makes it challenging, right? Because when we're studying and we're thinking about these social movements and social change, it's hard for us to go back in time and really try to freeze and understand that moment. There's things that we're going to miss. There's parts of movements that we're not going to capture, right? History isn't perfect. History is how we as humans try to make sense of the past. But that's okay because that helps us to understand better what movements are doing and how we can do better. So what I want us to do is to take some time to think about another protest or movement that might be involved in the issue of labor, right? So again, there's agricultural protests happening in California, but there have been a lot of other movements that have been focused on the issue of labor. And a lot of examples of these that are not necessarily based in the United States. So what I want you to do in a group is to find another example of some type of labor movement or protest that might have some similarities to this march, but I'd like your group to take some time to look at some of the ways that this group communicated. So got a pretty full house today, so let's do 3 groups. So we will do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So have within your groups the opportunity to look up and see what kind of labor movements have been happening across the world. And when you found one that you're interested in as a group, take some time to look into how this group is communicated.
They're very knowledgeable about it. And
I am fairly.
Why not?
I'm fairly knowledgeable.
what would you say?
You just try to- I'm just looking at people on Canva. Who- it's fantastic. Not very surprising that there are so many.
Yeah.
Breakfast being held on today. Why are we so long? So can you pick it up? Is that the moonlight? Yes. Oh, yeah, so just a big picture of general first. It doesn't, it affects the draft and the amount. There's something else like. A lot of but the money transfer is but they have to approval I just can search up. Oh, sorry.
Take about 5 more minutes to continue looking through this, and as you do, right, take note of what they're doing.
Oh, no, it would have been. And the train that was from hall and the country's biggest train, like, the whole decades. The cleaner thing, the one that was in the but this one forget.
Oh, yeah. And another minute to finish up and have presentation people to share. Hearing some of the conversations was any sign, seems like a lot of you were learning about new movements you didn't know existed, or in a couple of cases, movements that are happening right now as we speak. So let's talk a little bit about what came up in some of your groups. It sounds like you all were looking at the railroad strike, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What were the things that came up there with how they communicated and what you noticed?
So they're doing like a block off, so like not going into work
Mhm.
and having like a 24-hour strike, and this is like still ongoing.
Mhm.
And some of like the signs that they have, say safety jobs and our rail, our future.
Hmm.
And so, yeah.
Interesting, right? Because a lot of these movements, right, as we're saying, right, it's not this Griffin setup where things end, right? They have the consummation stage. A lot of these issues and challenges are continuing, persisting in different ways. Maybe there are new issues that are coming up as things like rail and how we travel have changed, right? So in thinking about this movement, I like the way that your group identified a lot of the aspects of communication, right? Like our rail, our future, promoting this idea of safety, right? The sort of reframes and things that people want to make sure that you know about their movement are these common tactics. I think in particular in thinking about movements related, for instance, to labor, to working conditions and so on, there's something that forces it to get attention. People are striking and not coming to work, or there's agricultural produce that's just not being produced, right? That because in a lot of these areas, it has such a large ripple effect on other people that it's drawing attention to this issue and inviting this kind of crisis point, right? So one thing to think about if you're thinking about your own advocacy or issues you're interested in communicating about is to think, what are the resources that I have available? What are the ways that I can make this issue known or identified or important to people who might not know about it? Because the idea that railway workers are not safe is not something that people without experience on that would necessarily know. So drawing attention to those topics can definitely play a really important role there. Looks like over here you all were talking about the U.S. Postal Service. What was going on in that situation?
We kind of said that like what they used to communicate was they use like strikes and they repeated it and they like there's all this stuff for like newspapers and they have like signs and
And you know, the Postal Service has a kind of very unique role, right, where it has federal funding, but has also had challenges with receiving funding. And there have been calls, for instance, for changing the post office and the way that it provides mail, for instance, discussion about moving it to a fourth work week, a lot of different proposals and policies on this issue, and sort of examining even the most contemporary history of the Postal Service and its advocacy, I think has been interesting. And again, it's another one of those cases where if members of the Postal Service strike or don't come to work and people stop receiving mail or packages, right, it suddenly draws attention to that topic in a way that it didn't before. But here in the back, what did you all focus on?
We talked about the Homestead Steel Strike in
Mhm.
1892. We said that for the first question, they went on strike and rioted. They used physical force, and it was definitely civil disobedience and was not peaceful.
Mhm.
And the second part, we said that they both have public support on fair wages for both involving minority groups,
Mhm.
and they both saw success in it.
Yeah. So I was looking back through sort of the aftermath of the 1966 farm workers protest that we talked about. And it turns out that following their march to Sacramento, there was one of the companies that was in charge of contracting eventually formed a new contract with the labor workers. And that contract ensured that their union was the sole representative of their collective bargaining and other kind of labor rights. So the idea there was that was not the catch-all solution, because there were a lot of course, other farmer and agricultural workers associated with other movements and not necessarily a part of that contract, right? But the idea of reaching a contract or agreement is oftentimes in a lot of these labor movements the goal. So success, at least immediate success, might be measured by creating some new agreement or framework when it feels like that entity is not listening in response to a lot of those conditions, right? And a lot of labor and work situations, including things like the minimum wage or a weekend, right? It's the crisis point that a lot of companies and businesses find themselves in, where they have to get to work, they have to have people, or they're going to go under, that can eventually cause that change, right? But it takes a lot of work to get there. In fact, many of the workers in 1966 were on strike for over 6 months. So it's challenging, but I think that a lot of these kinds of labor movements and advocacy are showing us how the use of physicality, the use of space, the use of these kinds of tactics is something that often is at the disposal of many of these groups. So I'm going to be shifting gears and having us explore the Occupy movement here in just a little bit, but let's take a short break. So it's about 1:52. Let's take it until about 2 or so. Welcome to use the restroom, get water, whatever you'd like, and we'll pick up and talk about this other chapter from Craig.
I started. I think that was the question. Yeah.
All right. So let's shift gears a little bit. And this is from the chapter 5 reading from Frank. This piece is talking about Occupy Homes Minnesota. And I think this piece gives us a lot to add to what makes for social change communication being effective. One of the big things that you all mentioned and why you're interested in taking this class, and the goal that you all had, is to understand how on issues that you care about and you see as important, you can make your communication more effective, right? And I think that this article in particular does a great job of going over how aspects of narratives and storytelling play a really major role in shaping the movement. When we were talking about things like the 1966 labor movement in California, it's not just that it happened, but it's a story, right? There's a context. There are people who were impacted and there's a goal that they had. And so our ability to sympathize with and understand that story, I think, is an important element to that movement work. Imagine what it was like if we were workers who were struggling to make ends meet, who were subject to unsafe conditions. All of those things really help to fuel the movement as working persuasively. So many of us are familiar with the Occupy movement, with Occupy Wall Street, right? It's also a movement that has gained a lot of criticism and pushback in terms of its effectiveness. A lot of people have been quick to say that the Occupy movement didn't work, but what the movement sparked and the policies and changes that it advocated for were oftentimes felt at more state or local levels, right? So the Occupy movement started in September of 2011. You might be familiar with it as the occupation of Zuccotti Park in Manhattan for a very long period of time. Protesters were there and essentially were able to stay and camp there for a very long period of time. And this was seen as sort of the beginning of the Occupy movement, which again, in 2011, it access to social media, technology, circulation. So things were spreading and being shared and talked about well outside of that single protest. And I think, again, connect to how we think about more modernly, the way that a social movement is happening online. It's happening through a lot of connections that we don't see in a lot of older movements. And I think it's useful, again, to think about context behind the Occupy movement. In particular, that, again, Arab Spring played a really major role. There was also a movement in Spain that was protesting austerity measures, right? And essentially the crunch to healthcare benefits and other services that workers were experiencing. Another thing that is useful to place in context is both what precluded the Occupy movement as well as the policy changes that the movement was critiquing. So in 2008, as we know, right, we had a Great Recession and financial crisis. And that crisis came about in large part due to the practices of banks and on home loans, right? In response to that financial crisis, one controversial element that was done to respond to that was to bail out many of the large banks who otherwise were going to go under as a result of this financial crash, right? And there was a lot of pushback against these bank bailouts, in large part because they were seen as benefiting corporations, including benefiting them for what were seen as predatory or risky tactics, and not directly benefiting people who were impacted by them, right? If you kind of follow this case, a lot of people were not able to pay their mortgages, pay for their homes. We had a very large sum of foreclosures due to the financial crisis. People were losing their jobs and not able to afford to make ends meet, right? So there was a lot of pushback against bailing out banks as a solution. If you're looking for an entertaining and surprisingly accurate portrayal of a lot of the events, the film The Big Short actually does a good job of breaking down a lot of the policies and practices that were happening that led to the 2008 financial crisis. So it's a fun and surprisingly accurate portrayal of these events. It's an area you're interested in learning more about. So the protest, right, was against corporate practices this notion of corporate personhood, right? We're thinking about the lead up to the 2012 presidential election, and that was Obama's reelection against former Governor Mitt Romney. There were very different policies about corporations, about how we should respond to corporations, corporate behavior, that were also kind of sparking this movement as well. So I think it's useful to look at this movement more generally, but also to understand the context that gave rise to Occupy Homes Minnesota, which prior to this article I actually wasn't familiar with, but it's really interesting, right? So Occupy Homes Minnesota was a movement that grew out of this larger Occupy movement, right? So one of the things that was substantially felt, of course, was foreclosure of homes following the 2008 financial crisis, but also the disparities in the homes that were affected. In fact, I believe it's about 11% of homeowners were people of color, but it amounted for 40% of foreclosures. So the impact of foreclosures, people losing their homes and losing access to shelter and things that they needed to survive were a really big problem. The problem is that when we think about something like a foreclosure, we think about something like a mortgage, the dominant frame in thinking about that at the time was something about personal responsibility. You pay your bills, you pay off your mortgage, you make your payments, it's up to you. You're responsible for doing that, right? But that frame wasn't really responding to the specific needs and crisis that a lot of homeowners found at that time, where you had a lot of communities where people had just been laid off and people could not afford to make ends meet. So Occupy Homes Minnesota was not just tasked with improving the material experiences of people that were losing their homes and losing those resources, but also in how this issue was being talked about and being framed. I find myself really interested in political communication, political framing. For instance, there are two political theorists called Frank Luntz and Fred Lakoff, who do a lot of studies related to how message framing and portraying political issues can be used. For example, right, referring to something as climate change versus global warming versus climate crisis, the framing of abortion debates between pro-life and pro-choice, right? The framing and language that we use to think about those issues is oftentimes stacked in a way that makes that topic appear better or more sympathetic to one group over the other, right? That if we frame something as, oh, well, it's just climate change, right? Change does not sound as threatening as crisis. So the way that we frame and talk about issues and who has control over that framing is a really important component of a lot of these types of movements. So the website for Occupy Homes Minnesota is still up and still has a lot of these stories and topics. The main page here goes over some general things here about Occupy Homes. They have actually a blog that's continuing to run and post experiences. Looks like it ended in 2013. But due to petitions, phone calls, marching on Wells Fargo, of course, which is a major bank, one of the members of the group was talking about how they were able to obtain shelter and stability, right? So there's been a lot of posts and material here about this type of movement. So what I want you to do is going back to the groups that you were working with earlier, the article that I'm asking you to read for this week about this piece actually has, it mentions it explicitly, but it's here on the website. So if you go to the Occupy Homes Minnesota website, which is occupyhomesmn.org, you can also just search Occupy Homes Minnesota. There's this entire section here called Our Homes. And on this section, there are a number of stories by some of the people who were directly impacted. And what I'd like you to do in your groups is take some time to look through some of these stories that are linked on the website. And as you're looking through, find one of those stories that you find especially interesting or maybe thought-provoking, and to take note of what communication is happening, what is being talked about or framed on this issue. So take some time in your groups to look at this, talk a little bit about this, and we'll be talking about this together. Yeah, there's just those few up there.
The one I just read. Oh, they marched. And then they came down on the law. And heard the same chant in the song.
Oops, who would like some more time? Okay. All right. So since this website is directly talked about for this chapter, I thought it would be interesting to look at it, see what it's doing, and use that to help understand what exactly is going on here. So let's talk about this. What was a story that kind of stood out, and what was the communication you all were starting to notice? And I'll try to pull these up as you're sharing. So let's start over here on this side. Mhm.
Who worked and went to school, and then so the similarities that we're noticing in the stories. They participated in like marches, held signs, and had chants, and they also like gained support from their neighbors and
Mhm.
communicated with them about their issues
Mhm.
to figure out ways to find like a solution to what they're going through.
Yeah, so it's very grassroots, right? The use of coordinating volunteers. There's even a public radio station, right? Public radio is oftentimes used to create this kind of local awareness to this day. I really think that the way that this is framed and talked about with her life experiences are really interesting. Did any of the other groups choose Jessica as well? You all did? Yeah.
Chose her first, so.
Chose her before, it was cool. Was there anything else you all noticed about her, about any of the other pieces here?
We just kind of said that she definitely used the emotional appeal
Mhm.
and tried to use ethos, and I might also use like credibility statements,
Mhm.
like showing that she's a good community member and that she's going to go on.
Yeah. So when it comes to a lot of social change and how we communicate about social change, right? Ethos gets put under a microscope. And there is a very deliberate strategy that's being used in how these pieces are talking about people's experiences, right? Because a lot of how we think about foreclosure or people who can't make a mortgage is framed under a personal responsibility frame. You're in charge of your finances, making ends meet, right? Resisting and pushing back against that frame is oftentimes done and say, I'm a responsible person, I'm a mother, I'm involved in XYZ, to show that these are people who, due to no fault of their own, have been impacted by this issue, right? So that type of framing, and like you're saying, Elena, the use of ethos is really important here. And again, also the use of pathos, use of emotional appeals, of using these kind of personal testimonials, stories, experiences to frame the issue are important. But here on this side, which one did you all choose?
We chose the bringing justice to justice, which was like on the main page. We
Oh,
could, like, read
yeah.
more.
Mhm.
So pretty much, it was posted by Anne Haynes. Pretty much, she went to DC to protest the Department of Justice
Mhm.
and some patterns of communication that we
There we go.
noticed where they camped out in front of the Department of Justice and they were using like chants and songs to kind of get across their message.
Mhm.
And there was like a couple marches and then people were doing speeches.
Yeah. So we've got this visual, says jail bankers, right? And talking about, as you were saying, the challenges of foreclosed homeowners, right? Got this other tent here as well. Even some videos. So there's a lot here, right? And even before that, this article right after that is interesting. Wells Fargo, don't evict my family. So one thing that is used as a strategy for Occupy Homes Minnesota, and is a broader strategy that a lot of social movements use as part of this narrative storytelling, is framing an antagonist, right? Oftentimes, when we're reading a good story, there's a villain, there's an antagonist, there's somebody who's having that oppositional role. If we think about the way a lot of the narratives and stories are structured, there's somebody who wants something, but there's someone or something that's in the way and obstructing that. So rather than frame it as I was irresponsible and my home got foreclosed, right? It is Wells Fargo and these other banks are throwing us out on the streets, right? And making it based off of the practices of these banks and groups and identifying those as antagonists, right? So again, I think that the Homes campaign and the communication strategies that are being used, right? For instance, on Rose's page, it says, I am like you, I've worked hard all my life. The way that Jamie talks about her own experiences, Chase Bank wants to throw me out, right? From a communication perspective, there's a whole lot that we could unpack here in describing these stories and describing these experiences, but they are used toward communication by, again, portraying this issue in a narrative way. So if you've taken a class like communication theory, there's a good chance that you're familiar with this idea of dramatism, or you've heard this idea or seen this pad discussed. How many people have seen dramatism or seen this pen pad discussed in other classes? So a couple of you. So essentially, this comes from Kenneth Burke, who was a real character, but also very prominent communication theorist, right? And Burke's idea is that human beings, right, we're natural storytellers. We tell stories to each other, and it's not saying you shouldn't drunk drive, right? It's oftentimes a very emotional commercial or event or story that involves drunk driving that's used to convince people not to. People see themselves and see a personal experience in which something awful has happened. They'll think to themselves, yikes, I shouldn't do this, right? To give you a personal example, and I mentioned this to a couple of folks in my interpersonal class, I was up at Anthony Lakes yesterday, and I love to hike up there. If you haven't been, it's a really nice mountain ski resort area. I was driving back last night, and there was a car that had driven off the road and completely flipped upside down, right? And there was a mother with two 4-year-old kids and a cat, and thankfully she's okay, she's unharmed. But she was really out of sorts, and she and her husband had a tent up at the top of the mountain. So I drove her up there and helped to get her settled into her tent, used the flashlight to help her get there and stuff, right? But what I remember thinking to myself is, she kind of swerved, she took the turn too quickly, and I'm glad she ended up being okay. But that experience, right, that event told me more about how to drive carefully at night than anybody ever would have if they just said, oh, don't take the turn too fast, right? Experiences that are personal, that impact us, that are felt, those are the things that really stick with us, right? In this way, narratives are stories, right? They're stories that define and provide meaning to issues and help us understand them. So in other words, right, humans love to read patterns. We like to find things that are in common. We like the idea that a story can oftentimes help us fit things neatly. For instance, the struggle for meaning and storytelling was incredibly apparent in Black Lives Matter, particularly surrounding George Floyd, right? There was a history of how people, particularly Black Americans, right, who are involved in some of these shootings and events are portrayed and talked about. The imagery that's used, the way that they might be framed as, an innocent bystander or being framed as somebody that is dangerous or criminal, right? That language and the way that people are talked about holds incredible power to frame the entire issue and story. So this is a crucial way for us to think about how social change communication works effectively, right? I think about the way that, for instance, political leaders, presidents, and so on are being portrayed, right? Oftentimes there's a narrative that emerges to describe people. So language that's used, for instance, in describing Trump and Biden, right? Using language about things related to their age, their mental faculties, right? Those narratives tend to emerge and be reinforced pretty constantly as part of trying to make a broader story or framing about them. So if we think about this idea of storytelling and of narratives as a really important tool in communication, right? Dramatism tells us that there's 5 different parts. So there is an agent, that is the person. So in this case, in Occupy Homes, Minnesota, right? The agent is the person like you just saw, whose home has been foreclosed, who's been struggling to make ends meet, and now is not able to take care of herself, right? There is the scene, right? The scene is the physical or social event in which the action is taking place. So there were photos, for instance, of chilly streets in Minnesota. It's very cold in the winter in Minnesota. Or, right, we think back to the farm workers strike, and we think about how the act of physically marching down that space established a scene as well. There's a purpose or goal, in this case, right, trying to prevent banks from kicking people out of their homes. There is agency, right, where the individuals being affected have the ability to have safe lives. They just need the extra help to get there. And then there is the act or the thing that has happened, in this case, the foreclosure, right? So that's the Burkean pentad. Courses like communication theory talk about that a little bit more. But it's, again, this idea that there has to be characters, there has to be plot, there has to be stakes to understand and make for a good story, right? Additionally, Walter Fisher has this idea known as the narrative paradigm that just builds off of that idea, that we use stories to communicate and that human beings are naturally drawn to storytelling. Again, we're much more likely to take drunk driving seriously if we have a public speaker come to our school and tell us a story about how they lost a close relative to drunk driving than we are to be told by a parent, don't drink and drive, right? Stories provide coherence. They also frame an issue. Again, how a bank should be portrayed, either as, this mean, awful entity that's throwing people out of homes, or how people are portrayed as responsible or irresponsible, and therefore at fault for foreclosure, right? Those issues are seen as important. I'll give you another example, right? There was, I believe it was a bank executive who was talking about the experiences of people who could not afford to pay rent, especially in the context of financial crisis. And his response essentially amounted to, well, maybe millennials need to go out and eat less avocado toast, right? That type of framing of, oh, it's not because people can't afford to pay rent or make ends meet, it's because of their own irresponsible financial choices, is used as a tactic, right? It's used to draw responsibility toward a particular group. There's another campaign that I think is incredibly powerful that emerged, particularly in context of the COVID-19 pandemic when it first started, right? And this campaign was called "I'm Not a Virus." Associated with COVID-19, there was a spike in violence and hate crimes that were targeted toward Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, under the false assumption, false racist assumption, right, that being Asian American or Pacific Islander meant that you were more likely to contract or spread COVID to other people. And that incredibly damaging false information and story was being used and of course, helped to spread some of those crimes. So a response that was developed from many Asian American communities was the "I'm Not a Virus" campaign, right? Where people would hold up signs and say that they were not a virus. And that became very popular and spread through social media, right? This idea of narratives and the power of narrative to say, I am not a virus, I am a human being who is impacted by this just as much as you are, was in many ways helping to go against this dominant narrative or frame that was coming up, right? That stories essentially are about exposing power relations. And in this situation are exposing things like the control. Again, in this Occupy Homes Minnesota, it's the banks are throwing me out. The bankers need to be put in jail. They're being kicked out, right? This practice is seen as the problem here. The reading talks about this idea that social change is about a struggle for meaning and the idea of making your narrative be the dominating narrative. When we see social change, we see social movements and issues being talked about, right? What we see is a struggle for meaning. That in many ways is at the heart of how social change communication and clashes are happening, right? How do we think about issues? How do we talk about issues, whether they're facts, whether they're policy, prescriptions, et cetera, right? When we think about, for example, environmental movements, a lot of the clash and narratives come between whether, climate crisis, climate change is happening, and people are being impacted, or whether it's a hoax and it isn't real, right? Although narrative has shifted and a lot more people are recognizing that human beings are contributing to impacts on the environment, right? So fidelity, truthfulness, and repetition are used to help narrative stick, right? Telling a story or a narrative over and over again is one of the biggest ways to make a narrative work. We see this a lot in political campaigns, where money is being spent and how people are being portrayed. Saying it over and over oftentimes will make something seem more persuasive just because we hear it, even if it's blatantly false, right? Even if somebody is telling a lie. That's where a lot of inaccurate and fraudulent reporting and fake news stories, right, tend to become popular because they are repeated. Fidelity is this idea of whether or not a narrative hangs together. In other words, internally, does the narrative make sense? In this case, does it make sense that this person was doing their best and got thrown out of their house and had no ability to offset that in a reasonable way? And then truthfulness is whether or not that story makes sense or seems true to us, right? The idea that a lot of individuals were facing foreclosure and crisis at the time made that narrative seem truthful. But, right, we find ourselves in a challenging position in which working against dominant narratives that frame or help us to think about an issue is a very difficult task, because oftentimes there is a story or way of thinking or bias or stereotype that somebody has about an issue, and thinking about it in a different way is like a very important thing, right? I was talking to somebody who was talking about how the language of homelessness was something they weren't a big fan of, and they were talking instead about this idea of houselessness due to the negative connotation that homelessness often has and its association with personal responsibility, right? That idea of how a narrative is being portrayed and the charged meaning we have with words and pushing against that meaning might be a way that campaigns try to work. And another idea here, right, is this idea that stories invite interactions. In addition to the idea of stories being persuasive because we're interested and invested in what's happening, Burke also puts forward this idea of identification. That is, we identify with or see parts of ourselves in the story that we're hearing, right? Oftentimes, some of our favorite movies are ones that have likable protagonists and characters that we care about and see a little bit of ourselves in. So that idea that we can relate to that story, even if we're not personally involved, is important. I could have been just like Kathy, who lost her home in the financial crisis, right? Would be an example of how the stories invite you to interact and participate within those. And also using the interactive website and other features like that are how stories can be used. So what I want you to do is take some time at the end for today. I want you to think about a scenario in which you're part of a campus-wide initiative that's trying to help ensure that EOU students have access to clean and safe drinking water. What is a way that you could frame this in a story or narrative way? So if you were trying to communicate to the community about this issue of having safe drinking water for students, how would you talk about this and how would you portray this issue? So take some time to think about some ideas here on how narrative might be used effectively. Yeah, so assume that there might be issues with accessing safe water on campus. Has been an off and on issue in Oregon.
Yes.
Want some more time or people feeling pretty good? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. Right, so we have this initiative to try to access clean and safe drinking water. So I'd like to hear some of the narratives or the ideas you all came up with on how you might share this topic. Let's hear first from the back over here. We can come back to you if you prefer.
No, we're good.
Okay.
Okay, so we decided to come up with some interesting facts about
Okay.
clean drinking water.
Yeah.
So we decided that 1 in every 10 EOU students get sick every year from cholera, preventing them from attending class. And that athletic performance is decreasing due to dehydration. And then we were planning on trying to tell a story about an athlete who got cholera and died.
That is okay. Right. Okay. Okay. You do have a water sticker on your laptop, so that gives you some authority there. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you, Elena. Even though you were, drawing from fictional information for this example, right? Having the story of an individual who's affected or impacted by this in a way that's like not their fault, right? An innocent bystander, that's used a lot, right? As a persuasive strategy. This person who did nothing wrong is trying to expose an injustice or issue that affects all of us, right? So I appreciate that as strategy there. But here on this side.
Okay, we didn't do like the hypothetical or whatever, but we just defend people and like a lot of us are student athletes here. It's really important to have like access to that water. Sometimes we don't have time to go home to like get bottled water, go to there, so it's important to have access to water to keep our bodies healthy and hydrated all the time.
Yeah. One thing that I like that I'm noticing is the through line, right, is that you're using kind of information that helps somebody who's not an athlete to understand, right? You need water all the time. You're regularly having it. So ensuring that you get that access is crucial to your well-being day to day. Like framing it in a way that's relatable, I think works really well as a strategy there. And here on this side.
So ours is fictional.
Okay.
Sure. As a student living on campus for 2 hours, all of our students are paying for tuition, room and board, meal plans, etc. Not everyone has the support of family by decision. After all the hidden fees in college, I simply do not have the money to pay for something that should be provided on campus. Water is completely unnecessary.
Yeah. Right. So that framing of water as a necessity, right, water as human right, is used in a lot of campaigns that are advocating for things like safe drinking water. And talking about the financial burden and impact and framing it in that way, I think really works too. Right. So the kind of overall takeaway here, right, is that you can find yourself in the right. You can find yourself advocating for an issue you feel passionately about and you support. And the question becomes, how do I tell this story or talk about this experience in a way that makes this relatable and important to somebody who might not know the same context that you do, right? And it's a very carefully developed and often curated process to create those narratives that can be persuasive and be compelling, right? A narrative does not mean it's not true. It just means it's being shared in a specific way that is meant to convey, persuade, convince. So I think that's a crucial part of how we communicate about social change. It's something that we can continue to explore as we go forward. So to wrap up for today, we talked about looking at farm workers' marches and similar examples, right, of how these types of movements create change, the roles that narratives and persuasive storytelling can have as a really powerful tool for social change, and this idea that both the story as well as the event itself and the spectacle and attention that that event gives can all come together to make that movement incredibly important. So we've been talking a lot about the idea that media is changing how we do movements, and I'm excited next week we're going to dive right into that. Right? Media has drastically changed how we communicate, how we do social movements and advocacy. And then the issues you care about is a crucial part of advocacy as well. So I'm looking forward to getting into some of that for next week. Have a great rest of your week. Enjoy your weekend. Make sure to complete that syllabus quiz and prompt if you're doing this week's prompt. Please either email or pass forward to the group's work for today if you haven't done so already. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll see you next week.
Everybody.